1970, I was 8 years old. A traveling salesman stopped by the house and he was selling these, the World Book Encyclopedia. This is the QR volume. I was particularly interested in the S volume for space and space travel. We had just landed on the moon. These encyclopedia were hot off the press, and there were images from the moon landing. I became interested in the other letters of the alphabet and looking at what information those volumes contained. And one that fascinated me was you get through Q, which is pretty quickly, and you get to R. Races of man, basic types. So they have all these wonderful illustrations, and they have page after page of these illustrations. Showing people from around the world. And of course, what they're also making sure they don't neglect are the cultural attributes of various populations. And then this section, the three great stocks of man. So we have the Negroid, Caucasoid, Mongoloid. And then you can see nose shape, lip shape and size, eye shape, eye color, skin color, all of these characteristics. Now, the terms Negroid, Caucasoid, Mongoloid come out of 19th century, early 20th century racial theory. And so they're still using these terms in the World Book Encyclopedia. I noticed that a lot of people feel like they need to avoid using the construct white, and so they'll say Caucasian, sort of more politically correct. I think some people hear it that way. But in fact, the more politically correct term is white, and not that I'm particularly interested in political correctness, but referring to white people as Caucasian or Caucasoid is like referring to black people as Negroes or Negroids. I mean, these are terms that are Asian people as Mongoloids. We don't use these terms anymore. So I'm surprised by the number of people who use the term Caucasian these days. So I'm going to read you 3 sections from this entry, which, despite the earlier part, which has been debunked, there are 3 sections that are quite insightful, and I want to use them as the anchor for what I'm going to argue. The first section is called Distribution of the Stocks. By that, it means the distribution of the races. There are more than 3.5 billion people in the world. Today, there's around 8 billion. It is difficult to group these people into the 3 basic stocks, for many races are descended from 2 different stocks, or even from all 3. In percentages, however, the Earth's population is about 34% Mongoloid, 56% Caucasoid, and 10% Negroid. Now, we should clarify something, that Mongoloid and Caucasoid, as those terms are used, don't exactly correspond to Asian and white. Caucasoid actually includes in this theory people in Central Asia, in the Middle East, North Africa, and Mongoloids then would be East Asians. This means that non-white people make up less than 1/2 of the world's population. Now, global demographics are different today. And then they point out that some anthropologists use different bases of groupings, and so they would put this figure higher. Second section, race superiority. Science does not support the claim that some races are biologically superior or inferior to others. Civilizations of any race may be advanced or retarded, and the people within them may have greater or smaller opportunities for contact and for personal development. People who live in advanced civilizations, regardless of race or stock, develop much more rapidly than people who live in retarded civilizations. But there is no scientific evidence to prove this has anything to do with inborn abilities or aptitudes. And that's true. As for the claims that this people or that race is the founder of culture and civilization, science can only call them absurd. There is no evidence that any single race, any single people, or any single nation has a special genius for creating civilization. However, several dictators have based their claims for world domination on the supposed fact that the people of their country belong to a superior race. They argued that because they were a superior race, they should rule the world. And then the final section, race and nationality. Race is often confused with nationality. People speak of the English race, or the German race, or the Italian race. But the people of these countries are descended from many races. They are properly called peoples. For each group has its own language, culture, tradition, and political ideals. But this does not make them races. The leaders of Nazi Germany talked a great deal about the purity of their race, but there was no scientific basis to this claim. The German language belongs to the widespread Indo-European linguistic stock, and the German people represent many races. It is also incorrect to speak, for example, of the Jewish race, because Jews form a religious and cultural group, not a racial one. Similarly, there is no Aryan race or Slavic race. Aryan and Slavic designate language families. This is Wilton Marion Krogman, who wrote this entry. That World Book Encyclopedia entry gets a lot correct. The author was a famous physical anthropologist. In fact, one of the founders of forensic anthropology. The first thing to clarify is that race is not culture, ethnicity, hairstyles, attire, music, art, nation, or religion. Ethnicity and the meaning of nation in line with this concept has to do with common ancestry, culture, and language. My wife is Swedish. She grew up in Sweden. She is of Swedish lineage, extending back for centuries. She speaks Swedish. She is proud of her Swedish culture. She is a Swede. But Swede is not her race. If asked what race she is, you would probably guess she's white. You would say this without knowing she was Swedish. If you spoke with her, you'd be hard-pressed to detect a Swedish accent. Maybe you don't even know what a Swedish accent sounds like. But even if you did detect this, you would not be detecting a racial characteristic, but an ethnic one. You would say she is white because of her skin color, her hair color, her eye color, her facial features, the things identified in that World Book Encyclopedia entry. But these surface features, what we call phenotypic features, do not reflect anything intrinsic or essential about my wife. You cannot know anything about her based on her racial identity. She could have grown up in any culture, spoken any language, worn any hairstyle or attire, practiced any religion, or no religion at all. I emphasize this distinction first because science depends on conceptual and terminological precision, but second because the inflation of the concept of race, or the use of race to explain things, has historically and in today's society continues to be used to divide populations for political and economic purposes. The conflation of culture or ethnicity with race is found in two traditions or ideologies. The first is the openly racist tradition. This is where culture is said to be a projection of race. If the material and non-material conditions of a culture are inadequate for human thriving, then that inferiority may be attributed to racial inferiority. This formulation assumes race is really a thing. If race is not a real thing, then the cause of cultural inferiority has been, at best, misidentified. Saying that all cultures are equal, which is what the relativists argue, does not solve the problem, since it is an objective fact that some cultures are more adequate for human thriving than others. The other tradition or ideology that conflates culture with race does so to make cultural features of an ethnic group appear to be essential. This is where the idea of cultural appropriation comes in, or where we hear critics of culture or religion being accused of racism. Cultural appropriation must suppose that cultural features associated with a group naturally belong to that group. It's a mystification. White, black, and so on are themselves cultural ideas. Race is not a pre-existing biological reality. Individuals are racialized by an ideology. That populations share genes with greater or lesser frequency is explained by a mundane fact. People tend to mate with people they live around. As a result, their offspring will generally look more like them than they will the parents of unrelated or less related offspring. The further apart the families, the more dissimilar the offspring will appear. Yet even in migration, people tend to reproduce with those who look like people from the places they left. Because of this, the appearance of so-called racial types enjoys stability over time and space. But the same is true with language and dialect. People who live around each other tend to sound like each other, not because they're biologically related, but because they live in the same culture or subculture. They also carry themselves similarly, but that does not mean they are a racial type. I highly recommend Keenan Malik's 1996 The Meaning of Race. Here he explains the history of this idea. For the definitive scientific demolition of race as a biological entity, I urge you to read The History and Geography of Human Genes, also published in 1996. This book appeared shortly after the appearance of The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, which was really about race, and J. Philippe Rushton's Race, Evolution, and Behavior. The History and Geography of Human Genes knocks down the premise these books share, that human variation can be explained by the three races of man model. Compiling decades of population genetic research and devising a clock to date the natural history of our species, Cavalli-Scavorza and Associates reconstruct the origins of human populations and the routes people took to spread the genome across the planet. And consequently, they show that race is confused with ancestry. The work Cavalli-Scavorza and Associates was buttressed that same year by the publication of an expanded edition of The Mismeasure of Man. Originally published in 1981, a classic work of debunking by evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould, took on the position that the social and economic differences between human groups, primarily races, classes, and sexes, arise from inherited inborn distinctions, and that society in this sense is an accurate reflection of biology. This is often referred to by proponents of this view as race realism. Race realism is a euphemism for a word that you should be familiar with: racism. The Mismeasure of Man was expanded to directly rebut the arguments advanced in the Bell Curve. You should check out Richard Lewontin's books, Biology is Ideology, The Doctrine of DNA, or his Not in Our Genes, Biology, Ideology, and Human Nature. Applied to categories of living things, the term race first occurs in the late 16th century and refers to breeding stocks of animals and plants. Thus, at its inception, it refers to biology and was increasingly applied to people with the development of scientific rationalism. By the 19th century, we find race being used to refer to physical or phenotypic traits, as well as associated capacities and proclivities, as a core concept in the developing science of evolutionary biology. As theory, albeit informally today, the discourse of natural history conceptualizes the various species as naturally sorting into biological categories, lying between subspecies and strains, varieties, or subraces. Just as different races or breeds of dogs had different capacities and propensities, hunting dogs differ from herding dogs not only in appearance, so do people possess different capacities and propensities depending on their racial classification, which is based on appearance. Both of the terms applying this view to people, racism and racialism, appear in the early 20th century. Race is thus the product of practical science of animal husbandry, caught up in the context of modern scientific revolution, and used by bourgeois elites to fracture the proletarian for economic and political advantage. So race is a category of people labeled and treated as similar because of some common phenotypic trait, such as skin color, hair texture, eye shape, etc. However, race cannot exist apart from the ideology that constructs it. Racism is an ideology assuming and advocating the belief that humans are subdivided into distinct groups that are different in their social behavior and mental capacities and moral worth, and can therefore be ranked as superior or inferior. The American Anthropological Association writes the following: at the end of the 20th century, we now understand that human cultural behavior is learned, conditioned into infants beginning at birth, and always subject to modification. No human is born with a built-in culture or language. Our temperaments, dispositions, and personalities, regardless of genetic propensities, are developed within sets of meanings and values that we call culture. Studies of infant and early childhood learning and behavior testify to the reality of our cultures informing who we are. We conclude that present-day inequalities, and we could add differences,
between so-called racial groups are not consequences of their biological inheritance, but products of historical and contemporary social, economic, educational, and political circumstances. Race may therefore be thought of as a socially constructed category. I am moved to focus on the topic in this way because of the resurgence not only of right-wing racialism, which has received a fair amount of press, but also because of left-wing identity politics, which is re-racializing and re-tribalizing society by treating individuals as personifications of the racial, ethnic, and religious groups to which they are assumed to belong. I was born in 1962 to civil rights activists, and the promise I saw during those struggles, as Martin Luther King Jr. put it so powerfully on August 28, 1963, in Washington, D.C., standing before the Lincoln Memorial.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today